Screams weren't what pulled Major Chloe Becker from deep REM sleep somewhere over the Rockies. It was the drop. That stomach-hollowing weightlessness hit the exact moment 300 tons of aluminum decided it no longer wanted to fly. Seconds later, the intercom cracked with a desperate plea. "We need a military pilot. Now." Major Chloe Becker did not care about the window seat. She didn't care about the view of the Seattle skyline, the rain streaking the scratched acrylic, or the fact that the man in 27E was spilling his elbows into her airspace. Chloe was operating on a deficit of sleep so profound it felt cellular. 36 hours ago, she had been strapped into the ejection seat of an F-35 Lightning II, pulling 9 Gs over a dusty stretch of unnamed desert. Now she was rammed into a Boeing 777, wearing gray sweatpants, a faded college hoodie, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones she'd paid too much for at a duty-free kiosk in Frankfurt. The transition from the tip of the spear to the back of the bus was always jarring. In a fighter jet, she was a god of the sky. In seat 27F, she was cargo, and right now, all this particular piece of cargo wanted was unconsciousness. She felt the heavy, lumbering pushback from the gate. She felt the rhythmic thud of the nose gear rolling over the tarmac center line. Then, the exhaust of the twin Pratt & Whitney engines spooled up, a low, resonant vibration that traveled up through the soles of her battered sneakers. It was a lullaby. Before the nose wheel even lifted off the runway, Chloe was asleep. It wasn't a peaceful sleep. Combat pilots rarely got those. It was a heavy, dark descent into the kind of rest a body demands at gunpoint. When she woke, she didn't open her eyes immediately. She didn't need to. Her inner ear, calibrated by thousands of hours of aggressive aerial maneuvers, told her everything she needed to know. The aircraft was in a right bank, a steep one, too steep for a commercial airliner. Then came the vibration. It wasn't the smooth, high-frequency hum of cruising altitude. It was a jagged, mechanical shudder. The kind of vibration that shakes plastic tray tables and makes the ice rattle in plastic cups. Chloe opened her eyes. The cabin was wrong. It wasn't chaotic, not yet. It was possessed by a stiff, suffocating silence. The man next to her in 27E had both hands clamped onto his armrests, his knuckles the color of old bone. Across the aisle, a mother was holding her toddler so tightly the kid was beginning to squirm and whine. Everyone was looking forward. No one was speaking. Chloe slipped one side of her headphones off. The engine sounded awful. The left engine was whining, a high-pitched, desperate spooling sound that indicated a compressor stall. The right engine was barely a low rumble. "We're descending," Chloe thought, "and fast." She looked out the window. They were in the soup. Thick gray cloud cover obscured everything, but the water droplets streaking across the glass were moving at an angle that confirmed her suspicion. They were losing altitude, and they were dropping like a stone. Suddenly, the PA system popped with a sharp burst of static. Usually, the voice on the other end was smooth, measured, and dripping with rehearsed calm. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're going to experience some rough air." Not this time. The voice that came through the cabin speakers was high, ragged, and out of breath. It sounded like a man who was simultaneously running a sprint and trying not to vomit. "Ladies and gentlemen, cabin crew, this is your first officer." A pause. A sharp intake of breath transmitted over the mic. We have a severe medical emergency in the flight deck. We have experienced a catastrophic pressurization event. The captain is incapacitated. A collective gasp rippled through the economy cabin. A woman 2 rows up started to cry. Chloe didn't move. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, listening past the panic, analyzing the data. Pressurization event, incapacitated captain, steep bank, engine surging. If there is a pilot on board, the first officer's voice cracked. Please ring your call button. Another pause. Longer this time. The shudder in the floorboards worsened. If there is a pilot on board with military flight experience, tactical experience, please ring your call button immediately. I repeat, I need a combat pilot. Chloe closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She thought about her deployment. She thought about the endless debriefs, the sheer exhaustion, the promise she made to herself that she wouldn't think about airplanes for at least 3 weeks. God damn it, she thought. She reached up and pressed the button above her head. A soft chime echoed in the tense cabin. It felt deafening. A flight attendant was there in less than 10 seconds. His name tag read, Greg. He was young, maybe 24, and his face was entirely devoid of color. He looked down at Chloe, taking in the messy bun, the oversized hoodie, the tired eyes. He was clearly expecting a square-jawed man in a polo shirt and khakis. You pressed it by mistake, ma'am? Greg whispered, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the row. No, Chloe said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic infecting the rest of the plane. She unbuckled her seatbelt. I'm a pilot. Commercial? Greg asked, hope flaring in his eyes. Air Force, F-35s, over 2,000 hours. Who's flying the plane, Greg? First Officer Miller, just Miller. Take me to him. Excuse me, sir, Chloe said to the man in 27E. She didn't wait for him to move. She simply climbed over his rigid legs, stepping into the aisle. The walk from row 27 to the front of a 777 is roughly 100 feet. It felt like a mile. Every eye in the cabin tracked her. They were looking for a savior, someone who looked the part. What they saw was a 5'7" woman in sweatpants looking intensely annoyed. As she moved past the wing line, the true nature of the aircraft's distress became physically apparent. The deck angle was steep. She had to grip the overhead bins to keep her balance, pulling herself uphill against the artificial gravity created by the descent. She passed first class. Even the wealthy passengers were terrified. A businessman in 2A was clutching a rosary. Greg punched a code into the keypad outside the reinforced cockpit door. The red light blinked green. A heavy lock disengaged with a metallic clack. Go, Greg said, stepping back into the galley. God bless you. Chloe pushed the door open and stepped into the flight deck. The contrast between the silent terror of the cabin and the sheer auditory violence of the cockpit was staggering. It was a sensory assault. The first thing that hit her was the cold. It was freezing, the air whipping through the confined space. The left side of the windscreen was a spider web of shattered glass. A baseball-sized hole near the frame was shrieking as 300-knot wind tore through it. The second thing was the noise. Alarms were screaming in a chaotic symphony of failure. The master caution light was flashing a blinding, rhythmic yellow. A synthetic robotic voice was blaring through the speakers over and over. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up. Pull up. Bank angle. Bank angle. The captain was slumped over in the left seat. Blood was smeared across the control column and dripping onto his white uniform shirt. A piece of the shattered windshield frame had evidently struck him in the temple during the blowout. He was unconscious, his dead weight leaning against the yoke, forcing the plane into its lethal right bank. In the right seat sat First Officer Miller. He was young, maybe 30, and he was losing his mind. He was hauling back on his control column with both hands, his arms shaking violently, fighting the dead weight of the captain on the linked yoke. Sweat was pouring down his face, mixing with tears of sheer exertion and panic. "Hey," Chloe said. Miller didn't hear her over the alarms and the rushing wind. He was hyperventilating, staring blankly at the altimeter, which was unwinding at a terrifying speed. Chloe didn't wait for an introduction. She moved behind the captain's seat, grabbed him by the shoulders of his uniform, and hauled him backward. He was heavy, a solid 200 pounds of dead weight. She gritted her teeth, bracing her legs against the center pedestal, and yanked him back, locking his shoulder harness to keep him upright and off the controls. The moment the captain's weight left the yoke, the control column snapped back to neutral. Miller gasped as the pressure released, but he immediately overcorrected, jerking the yoke to the left. The 707 shuddered violently, the metal groaning in protest as the heavy jet wallowed in the sky. "Get your hands off the yoke!" Chloe shouted over the wind. Miller jumped, snapping his head around. He looked at her with wild, uncomprehending eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Major Chloe Becker, United States Air Force," she yelled, stepping over the center console and sliding into the jump seat directly behind the center pedestal. She didn't have time to strap in. She leaned forward, scanning the instrument panels. It was a Christmas tree of red and yellow lights. "Give me a sit rep, Miller, now." We hit a bird strike or something. Clear air, then boom. Windshield blew. Decompression. Dave got hit. He's bleeding. Dave is out. It's just you and me. What's wrong with the jet?" "I don't know," Miller screamed, his voice cracking. "Left engine is surging. We're losing hydraulics on the green system, and the trim is run away. I can't keep the nose up." Chloe's eyes darted across the digital displays. F-35s were different from Boeings, but physics was physics, and avionics all spoke a similar language if one knew how to read it. Altitude, 14,000 feet. They had dropped 20,000 feet in minutes. The Rockies were directly below them, hidden in the clouds. Airspeed, 340 knots. Too fast. Left engine N1, fluctuating wildly. Hydraulics, pressure dropping. "You're in a graveyard spiral, Miller," Chloe said, her voice dropping into the cold, clinical register she used during combat engagements. The fear center of her brain had shut down, replaced entirely by procedural logic. "You're fighting the trim and you're asymmetric on thrust. Pull the left engine throttle back to idle." "But we'll lose altitude." "We're already losing altitude, and that engine is trying to tear itself off the wing. Idle. Now." Miller hesitated. His hands were shaking over the throttle quadrant. Chloe leaned over the console, clamped her hand over his, and physically forced the left throttle lever back to the idle stop. The horrific surging whine from the left side of the aircraft ceased immediately. "Right engine to 70%, Chloe commanded. "We need asymmetrical thrust to counter the drag from the dead side. Step on the left rudder. Heavy." Miller pushed the rudder pedal. The nose of the massive aircraft slowly began to swing back in line. The violent shaking subsided into a dull, heavy vibration. "Good," Chloe said, never taking her eyes off the attitude indicator. "Now, Let's fix the pitch. Your automatic trim is fighting you. Disengage the autopilot and manual trim override. I can't reach it. I'm holding the yoke. Chloe reached past him, her arm brushing his shoulder. She flicked 3 switches in rapid succession on the center console. The heavy artificial resistance in the yoke vanished. "Fly the airplane, Miller," Chloe said, her tone demanding absolute compliance. "Pull back, smoothly, do not jerk it. Give me 5 degrees nose up." Miller took a ragged breath. He pulled back on the yoke. The 777 groaned. The G-forces pressed Chloe down into the jump seat as the nose finally, agonizingly, began to rise. The altimeter stabilized. 11,200 feet. The robotic voice stopped screaming terrain. The flight deck was suddenly, relatively quiet, save for the howling wind tearing through the broken glass. Miller let out a sob, his head dropping forward for a fraction of a second. "Oh my God, we stopped falling." "Don't get comfortable," Chloe said, leaning back and finally pulling the jump seat harness over her shoulders. She snapped the buckle into place. She looked at the fuel gauges, then at the hydraulic pressure lines. The green hydraulic system was dead. The center system was bleeding out. "We stopped falling," Chloe said, her voice devoid of comfort. "But we are flying a crippled brick. We have no left engine, and we are leaking hydraulic fluid. Where is the nearest strip of concrete?" Miller stared at the navigation display. Denver International. It's about 80 miles east." Chloe looked out the front window. The clouds were thick, a wall of impenetrable gray. They had no autopilot, compromised flight controls, and a pilot who was 1 heartbeat away from a total nervous breakdown. "All right, Miller," Chloe said, reaching out and tapping the communication frequency panel. "Declare an emergency. Tell Denver approach we're coming in, and tell them to roll the fire trucks." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the flight management computer. The adrenaline was finally hitting her bloodstream, a cold, sharp spike that chased away the last remnants of her fatigue. She wasn't a passenger anymore. "Let's get this pig on the ground." The flight deck of a Boeing 777 is designed to be a sterile, highly controlled environment. Right now, it was a wind tunnel smelling of ozone, copper, and hydraulic fluid. The cold was becoming a serious problem. The air blasting through the shattered left windscreen was well below freezing. Chloe could feel her fingers growing stiff, the joints aching as she gripped the edges of the center console. She didn't have gloves. She didn't have a jacket. Just the faded college hoodie that was entirely inadequate for a high-altitude decompression event. "Denver approach. This is Heavy Jet 09er Alpha, declaring an emergency," Miller said. His voice shook, but he was getting the words out. Chloe's presence, radiating a cold, irritated competence, was acting as a bizarre sort of gravity for his spiraling panic. "We have a blown windshield, pilot incapacitated, loss of left engine, and critical hydraulic failure. Requesting immediate vectors to the longest piece of pavement you have." The radio crackled. The voice on the other end was tight, professional, but the underlying tension was palpable. 09er Alpha, Denver approach. We have you on radar. Descending through 10,000. Turn left, heading 040. Expect runway 16 right. Wind is 290 at 15, gusting to 25. Equipment is rolling. 040, Miller repeated, his hand trembling on the yoke. He stepped on the rudder, trying to initiate the turn. The heavy jet wallowed. Without the left engine, Every maneuver was a fight against physics. The asymmetric thrust from the right engine constantly tried to push the nose left. Turning further left meant reducing that thrust and risking a stall, or fighting the dead weight of the airframe with compromised flight controls. "Watch your airspeed, Miller," Chloe snapped. "You're bleeding energy. Nose down, 2 degrees. Keep the speed at 240 knots. We are not a glider. We are a brick with half a propulsion system." "I can't. The yoke is so heavy," Miller grunted, his biceps straining beneath his white uniform shirt. "Hydraulics are bleeding out," Chloe observed, tapping the glass display. The center system pressure was dropping through the yellow arc, heading for the red line. "We're losing the boost. It's going to get heavier." She unbuckled her jump seat harness and stood up, bracing herself against the violent buffeting of the wind. She reached over Miller's shoulder and placed her hands over his on the yoke. "I've got the controls," she said. "You don't know this airframe," Miller protested. Though he didn't fight her, he was desperately relieved to let go. "A plane is a plane," Chloe said, gripping the cold plastic. "It just wants to fly or it wants to fall. We just have to convince it to do the former a little longer than the latter. You work the radios and the configuration. I fly." The physical feedback from the yoke was horrendous. In the F-35, the fly-by-wire system interpreted her inputs and made the jet dance. Here, she was physically hauling on cables and pulleys that were moving massive slabs of metal through thick, turbulent air, fighting the drag of a dead engine and a damaged airframe. Her shoulders burned almost instantly. They hit the cloud deck at 9,000 feet. The world outside the shattered window disappeared into a violent, churning gray. The turbulence intensified. The 777 bucked, dropping 50 feet in a stomach-churning instant before slamming into a wall of updraft. In the back, 300 people were likely screaming. In the cockpit, there was only the roar of the wind, the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 conscious pilots, and the mechanical protests of a dying airplane. "Denver, 09er Alpha. We are in the soup and getting kicked around," Miller reported, his hands bracing against the instrument panel. "Give me a distance to the marker. 09er Alpha, you are 20 miles out. Maintain heading. Be advised, cloud base is at 1,000 feet. You're going to break out low." "Copy," Miller said. He looked at Chloe. "If we break out at 1,000 feet and we're not lined up." "We'll be lined up," Chloe said. Her eyes were locked on the artificial horizon and the localizer needle. It was a video game, a very physical, very terrifying video game where the reset button was a crater in the Colorado dirt. "Miller, we need to talk about the gear," Chloe said, her voice raising to cut through a sudden shriek of wind. Miller looked at the hydraulic systems display. His face went pale. "Center system is gone. Right system is compromised." "Will the gear drop?" "Not normally," Miller said, swallowing hard. "We have to use the alternate extension, gravity drop, but with the asymmetric drag, it's going to throw us all over the sky when those doors open." "Then we drop it late," Chloe decided. Her arms were trembling from the exertion of holding the yoke. "We wait until we break the clouds, 5 miles out, no sooner. If they don't lock, then we spark," Chloe said flatly. "But if we drop them now, the drag will stall us out before we even see the runway." The altimeter unwound. 6,000 feet, 5,000, 3,000. The cold was a physical weight now. Chloe couldn't feel her nose. The blood on the captain's shirt had congealed into a dark, frozen crust. She forced herself to ignore him. Compartmentalization. It was what the Air Force taught her. Put the trauma in a box, lock the box, fly the jet. Mourn later. Panic never. 2,000 feet, Miller called out, acting as the radar altimeter. The turbulence was a constant, violent shaking. The right engine was howling, working overtime to keep them airborne. 1,500, still in the clouds. Come on, Chloe muttered, her knuckles white on the yoke. Show me the ground. 1,200. The gray outside the windows suddenly began to thin. The dark, heavy moisture tore apart, revealing flashes of brown and dull green. And then they dropped out of the ceiling. The transition from the claustrophobic gray void to the stark reality of the Denver plains was instantaneous. Runway in sight, Miller shouted, pointing through the cracked right windshield. Chloe saw it, a long gray ribbon of concrete stretching out amidst the sprawling infrastructure of Denver International. But it wasn't where it was supposed to be. The fierce crosswind, combined with their asymmetric thrust, had pushed them significantly right of the center line. They were drifting, fast. I have the runway, Chloe grunted. She banked hard to the left, stepping heavily on the rudder. The 777 groaned, the metal airframe complaining bitterly about the aggressive maneuver. Altitude is 800, Miller yelled. Sink rate is high, sink rate is high. The automated voice joined in, a dispassionate observer to their impending doom. Sink rate, pull up. Drop the gear, Miller, Chloe roared. Alternate extension, now! Miller reached up to the overhead panel, unlatched the heavy alternate gear extension lever, and pulled it down with all his body weight. Beneath them, the belly of the beast opened. The massive main landing gear assemblies, unpowered by hydraulics, fell out of their bays, relying entirely on gravity and airflow to lock into place. The drag hit them like a physical wall. The nose pitched down violently. Chloe hauled back on the yoke, planting her feet against the rudder pedals for leverage. A scream tore from her throat as she fought the immense mechanical weight of the diving aircraft. Thump, thump, thump. 3 distinct heavy vibrations shook the floorboards. 3 green, Miller screamed, staring at the gear indicators. They're locked! Gear is down! Flaps, Chloe demanded. We don't have the hydraulics for full flaps. Give me whatever you have. 15 degrees. Just give me some lift. Miller threw the flap lever. The electric backup motors whined in protest, extending the leading and trailing edges just enough to change the aerodynamic profile of the wings. It bought them seconds. The runway was rushing up to meet them, a massive slab of concrete expanding in the windshield. They were still crabbing heavily into the wind, the nose pointed nearly 15 degrees away from the actual direction of travel. We're coming in crooked. Miller braced his hands against the dashboard. I know, Chloe said through gritted teeth. In a normal landing, a pilot kicks the rudder at the last second to straighten the nose before the wheels touch down, a maneuver called de-crabbing. But Chloe knew this wasn't a normal plane anymore. If she took her foot off that rudder to straighten out, the asymmetric thrust from the right engine would instantly spin them off the runway. She had to land it crooked. She had to plant the heavy main gear onto the concrete while moving sideways. 50, 40, 30. The robotic voice counted down the final feet. Hold on to something, Chloe yelled. 20, 10. She chopped the right throttle to idle. The sudden loss of thrust caused the right wing to dip violently. Chloe fought it, yanking the yoke left. The right main landing gear hit the concrete first. It wasn't a touchdown. It was an arrival, a brutal, bone-jarring impact that sent a shockwave up through the seats and rattled the teeth in Chloe's skull. 300 tons of metal slammed into the earth with the grace of a dropped anvil. The right tires shrieked, instantly converting rubber into smoke as they hit the pavement sideways. 2 of the tires blew immediately, the sound like cannon fire over the roar of the wind. The plane violently slammed down onto the left main gear next. The aircraft skidded, fighting for directional control. "Brakes, brakes!" Chloe yelled, stomping on the tops of the rudder pedals. "No anti-skid! We have no anti-skid!" Miller yelled back, his own feet mashed against the pedals. The plane was hydroplaning on melted rubber, skidding sideways down the runway at 140 knots. Sparks began to shower past the windows as the bare metal rims of the blown right tires ground into the concrete. Chloe fought the yoke, using every ounce of aerodynamic control she had left to keep the wing from dipping and striking the ground. If the engine pod touched the concrete, they would flip. The end of the runway was approaching fast. The grass overrun area loomed ahead. "Reverse thrust!" Chloe yelled. Miller grabbed the right throttle lever and hauled it up and back. The massive clamshell doors on the surviving engine deployed, redirecting the exhaust forward. The deceleration was violent, throwing them against their shoulder harnesses. The nose wheel slammed down hard. The speed bled off. 100 knots, 80, 50. The massive aircraft finally lost its fight against friction. It shuddered heavily, the bare metal wheels grinding into the pavement with a terrible screech, and lurched to a sudden, violent stop. They were 20 feet from the end of the runway. The nose wheel was buried in the mud of the overrun area. Silence descended on the cockpit. It wasn't complete silence. The wind was still howling through the broken window, and the APU was whining in the background. But compared to the screaming alarms and the roar of the engines, it felt like a tomb. Chloe sat frozen, her hands still clamped in a death grip around the yoke. She was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. Her arms felt like they were made of lead. Next to her, Miller slowly lowered his hands. He looked out the window at the flashing lights of the approaching fire trucks. Then he unbuckled his harness, leaned over the center console, and threw up onto the floor. Chloe finally let go of the yoke. Her hands were locked into claws, shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline was draining out of her, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. She turned around and looked at the captain. He was still unconscious, but his chest was rising and falling. The cockpit door burst open. Greg, the young flight attendant, stood there. His hair was a mess, his uniform torn, and he looked like he had aged 10 years. Behind him, the sounds of crying, cheering, and hysterical relief echoed from the cabin. Are we down?" Greg whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the ruined cockpit and the blood. Chloe slowly unbuckled her harness. She stood up, ignoring the burning ache in her shoulders and the cold seeping into her bones. She reached into the pocket of her sweatpants, pulled out her noise-canceling headphones, and slipped them around her neck. "Yeah, Greg," Chloe said, her voice raspy and bone-dry. "We're down. Tell the passengers to remain seated, and find me a medic for the captain." She stepped past him into the galley, leaning heavily against the bulkhead. She closed her eyes, the phantom sensation of falling still echoing in her inner ear. The 3-week vacation she had promised herself was no longer a suggestion. It was a mandate, that hollow drop, the smell of ozone, the deafening roar of wind. It's a nightmare that became Major Chloe Becker's reality. When the system fails, it's not the machine that saves the day. It's the human refusing to surrender to gravity. If this story got your pulse pounding, hit the like button to support the channel. Share it with someone who loves a tense thriller, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into incredible stories of survival. Stay grounded out there,